Hey guys, Miss Shaw here. I am here to give you a lesson on some of the civil rights, on the civil rights movements from the 50s and 60s. We're going to be reading a book that is going to talk about some of these things, and so we want you to have a background for that. Yesterday, you did a little bit of a scavenger hunt on that. I'm taking some notes from 1963, the specific year. Now we're going to talk about all of the civil rights movements, just some high points of the movement, so you've got some background information. We want to start with what life was like before the civil rights movement. Before we can actually talk about what happened during the civil rights movement, let's talk about what it looked like before. So you have a note sheet. You're going to keep up with that as we go through the video. And as we do, you're going to be filling it in. It should be in your OneNote. So on this first part, you're going to be writing 3 to 5 sentences to describe what life was like before the civil rights movement based on these pictures you're about to see. And when you look at these pictures, I want you looking at everything. I want you to look at the background. I want you to look at the ethnicity of the people in the picture. I want you reading the signs and really try to gain an idea of what life was like before the actual movement occurred. So let's talk about what segregation actually is, that vocabulary. So segregation is the separation of people according to race or ethnicity. Okay, so it wasn't just about separating African Americans from whites. It was also about separating Hispanics from whites. So it was all ethnicities being separated from whites. Before 1950, segregation was common and normal in the U.S., and what it did was it deprived minorities of their rights. There were 2 different kinds of segregation. One was segregation by law, and this was more common in the South. The other was de facto segregation, that was segregation without laws. So if it was legal, it was things that forbid African Americans from attending the same church, using the same swimming pool, eating in restaurants, or marrying white people. And that was something that was put into law and was legal. In de facto segregation, where it wasn't legal to segregate, they still would, but they would do things like housing discrimination, where they would have a white community and only whites could live in that neighborhood, and every ethnic group had its own part of town. So life for African Americans was very difficult. Nationwide, it was, there was segregation throughout. Employment was hard. Generally, African Americans filled the lowest paid, least desirable positions. They went by the quote, last hired, first fired, which meant they hired whites, they hired all other ethnicities first, and hired the African Americans last, so that they could be the first people that were hired or last people that were fired if that ever needed to happen. There was a higher rate of illiteracy and poverty. The standard of living was lower, and there was a shorter life expectancy. There were also fewer black homeowners than white homeowners. And specifically in the South, it was where it was legal to segregate. And that was through things like Plessy versus Ferguson, where they said African Americans lived separate but equal. They had all the same equal rights, but lived separately. There was segregation of beaches, cemeteries, hospitals, restaurants, transportation, and their voting was limited. They were still allowed to vote. It was legal for them to vote, but they were disenfranchised, which means that very few were actually allowed to vote because of grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and poll taxes that were put on the voting booths. So one of the first main events that we're going to talk about, and you'll need to understand for your research project coming up, is about the Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. This particular legal argument challenged the separate of equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson that I kind of talked about a while ago. The attorney argued before the Supreme Court, and in this, there was a unanimous decision that as far as public education is concerned, the separate but equal was no longer legal. It had no place in public education. This was strongly opposed by whites, and the desegregation because of this was very, very slow. So the 14th Amendment states that it granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection by the laws. So what Plessy versus Ferguson did was it asked the question of, was separating blacks and whites on railroad cars legal? This decision was split, but it did state that separate but equal, that law did not violate the 14th Amendment, which, remember, the 14th Amendment gives all rights equal protection of the laws. So then we get the Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. Their question was, can this African-American child go to an all-white school? The decision said that separate but equal facilities were inherently unequal, and it needed to be desegregated, that segregated schools violated the 14th Amendment. The next event we're going to talk about was in Montgomery, Alabama, and it was a boycott, a public bus boycott. You've heard the name Rosa Parks before. She was asked to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. When she refused, she was arrested. And this started a boycott that lasted over a year. Because of this, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated buses were unconstitutional. And then in 1957, we had the first of 3 Civil Rights Acts. This first one established the United States Civil Rights Commission, and this is where all civil rights were investigated. All the violations of civil rights were investigated. One of the main things that they looked at was voting rights of African Americans. So Birmingham, Alabama was considered one of the most segregated cities in the nation. During this time, Dr. King was arrested and sent to jail for protesting segregation in Birmingham. While he was arrested, while he was in jail, he read an open letter from 8 white clergymen that was in the local newspaper, and they were criticizing him and his fellow activists. So he came back with a 20-plus page letter that made national news. It's labeled the Letter from Birmingham Jail, and it's one of Martin Luther King's big written pieces in response to these 8 white clergymen. The actual letter is on display in a museum to be seen and read, and you can kind of see from the picture, it's very, very long. All right, the next event we're going to talk about is the Children's March of 1963. We are still in Birmingham, Alabama. It is still very, very racist, and it was one of the big locations for the civil rights movement. So during this time, we had a lot of youths that were involved in the civil rights movement. And this particular event had more than 4,000 African American school children who organized to walk out of classrooms. So they, under complete secrecy, planned a day and a time. And at exactly 11 a.m. on May 2nd, 1963, more than 4,000 African American school children walked out of their classrooms. And this started off a week of mass demonstrations and rioting that the youth and the children of Alabama, that the nation really took a look at. We're going to watch a little video on the Children's March.
This was the day where every student in Birmingham knew that it was going to happen.
But you gotta remember that all of the planning was a secret.
Good. Go to their room. Good morning, children. Up in the morning and out to school. The teacher is teaching the golden rule.
I remember that morning I woke up with my mind on freedom.
Oh, I took special pain with putting a little starch in my blouse.
Got my toothbrush and I got the toothpaste, the soap.
Because I had a feeling that I wouldn't be coming home.
Ring, ring goes the bell.
Well, this doctor pushed D-Day. But they wouldn't even use D-Day. They used all that jive talk.
Don't forget, kids, there's going to be a party in the park. And don't forget your toothbrushes, because luncheon will be served.
Back in the classroom, open your book.
Now, everybody who's listening knows what the deal is.
D-Day was the day. My mother said, okay, Gwen, don't go to that march. I mean, don't go. You go to school. I told my mother, I said, I hear you. We were raised not to lie. So I didn't tell her lies that I wasn't going. I said, I hear you.
We would have people picked out. Your job is to turn this fire alarm, turn that fire alarm, get the football team, basketball team, get the cheerleader, get the band.
It was right at 11 o'clock when they arrived. They came up to the fence with a sign that just said, it's time.
When we said, let's go for the window.
And I told others, come on, let's go. And I looked around and, all I could see was my own fanny almost, I hollered back up at those kids, but you said you were going to go. You promised. And that's when kids started coming.
They were coming out of windows, coming out of doors.
It's so beautiful. You wouldn't believe it. Mrs. Scurry turned her back as we got up.
And we took it from there.
I wanted to walk out with her, but it was my job.
There was nothing you could do once the students started moving. The principal, the teachers, and everybody had to step aside.
My boyfriend tried to stop me from going, and I walked around the building, and I came right back out there and went at it.
You have about 2 children left in the class, maybe. Everybody's gone. I'm sure that morning Bevel was nervous about who was going to show up.
At first there were a few, then there were hundreds, then there were thousands.
We heard that kids were coming in from all over the city. And when we heard that they were coming in from out of town, we got more excited.
And I had a cool car. They said, okay, we need you to go out to Fairfield. There's some students outside the classroom that won't go back in. Lo and behold, when I got out to Fairfield, the whole campus was outside of the building, and they all said, we going to Birmingham.
20 kids climbed on the car, and 800 followed behind it.
I love the way you walk. I love the way you walk.
The more we walked, the more we gathered, and every once in a while you look back and you saw it was more kids coming from somewhere, from another direction. You said, where are all these kids coming from?
You had never seen that many people in your life. It's like a football game.
Kids walked as far as 18 miles to get to Birmingham in order to be arrested.
and the purpose was to go to jail.
The gathering place was 16th Street Baptist Church.
Oh, we poured into 16th Street like a waterfall.
They were coming in all doors, from all directions, from the basement, from the back.
It was just like one big pep rally. Here's Park, are you in the house? Or Western, are you in the house?
Children were ready. They were ready to hit the streets.
All right. The next event that we're going to talk about was the March on Washington. This was August 28th, 1963, and there were over 200,000 peaceful demonstrators that went to Washington to protest. This is where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech at Lincoln Memorial, and it was broadcasted live on national television.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. One day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Not shortly after that, September 15th of 1963, you remember we saw the 16th Street Baptist Church was the location of the Children's March. There was a bombing in this church, and 4 young girls were killed when the bomb exploded. Here's some images of the aftermath of that bombing. These are the 4 girls that were killed. In July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act became law. It established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The Justice Department could prosecute discrimination. If there was ever discrimination with a job or housing based on race, color, sex, or national origin, it could now be prosecuted. It outlawed segregation in public, so the separate drinking fountains were no longer allowed, and it required all schools to desegregate. Because of the civil rights movement, Congress passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it ended all racial discrimination in public facilities, such as restrooms, restaurants, buses, movie theaters, and swimming pools. And then 4 years later, there was a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this was created to enforce equal housing opportunities for all races. While the Civil Rights Act got rid of discrimination, there was still some issues with all housing. So the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was just a follow-up to that, and basically said that you cannot refuse to rent or sell a house to anyone, anywhere, based on their race. So one of the things that you need to understand is how they did it. The civil rights movement was nonviolent protests, just some civil disobedience and legal action. It wasn't rioting and lighting things on fire. It was nonviolent. Here are some examples of those nonviolent protests. There were boycotts, which is where they refused to buy goods or services, or just like the bus boycott in Montgomery, they refused to ride the bus. There were hunger strikes where they refused to eat anything in order to get the attention for a cause. There were petitions, which is where they wrote a letter and asked a government or committee to change its policy, and then they got people to sign it. There were marches and demonstrations, just like the Children's March and the March on Washington. There were strikes where people would refuse to work in order to force their managers or government to change the policy. And then there were sit-ins where protesters came into a place, sat down, and then refused to move. Just like Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat. All right, we're going to watch one last video that kind of encompasses a little bit of everything. While we watch this, I want you to, on your notes, explain why Alabama was considered the most racist state in the country in the 1960s.
In 1963, a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States was still a nation divided. Segregation kept blacks and whites in separate worlds, which were anything but equal.
It would take the courage and sacrifice of the young and innocent to shock a nation that believed itself the bastion of democracy into truly making America a place with liberty and justice for all.
The time had come to say, no more.
No more. No more.
In 1954, the ruling of the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education declared that separate was inherently unequal and that integration ought to proceed with all deliberate speed. Not everyone agreed.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In Birmingham, Alabama, desegregation was a dangerous business, no matter what the courts said. With more than 20 unsolved bombings between 1957 and 1963 and KKK associates in positions of power, Birmingham was a stronghold of racial oppression and intimidation. After his setback in Albany, Georgia, Martin Luther King arrived in Birmingham on April 3, 1963, for a make-or-break battle of the dying civil rights movement.
Project C got off to a disappointing start. A court injunction against parading and an 800% increase in bail costs made a trip to jail more likely to last 6 months than 6 days. Marchers realistically feared losing their jobs and their homes. Few volunteered. Fewer were arrested. On April 12th, King tried to draw people by marching himself. He and Ralph Abernathy went to jail. In King's absence, jive-talking James Bevel held the floor at the mass meetings and struck a chord with the young people who didn't have jobs or own homes. They began to volunteer in droves. Bevel started a whisper campaign for student demonstrations. When King was released on April 20th, he was highly conflicted over the use of children as marchers. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, however, summed up the situation when he said, "We gotta use what we got."
Black parents tried to shield their children from the harsh reality of segregation, but it wasn't always possible.
March of 63, they blew up the church next to our house. My father's car was set on fire. He was also ran off a bridge one night. It was tough.
One of the worst nights of Chris McNair's life was when he had to tell his daughter the reason he couldn't buy her the sandwich she'd wanted at a store that day was that she was black. Still, they hoped. When Barbara Cross and her family moved to Birmingham in 1962, her father, Reverend John Cross, tried to get into a taxi.
And he said, "We don't carry your kind." My father told him, "Before I leave Alabama, he'll be carrying anyone who wants to catch a case."
Civil rights photographer Charles Moore remembers his father saying, "Son, you don't treat people poorly because they are a different color." Other white children were not so lucky, spoon-fed hatred and lies of black inferiority and prevented by segregation from befriending black children. Many believed what they'd been taught. White student Charles Entrekin pointed out that people breathe in the prejudices of their culture without any understanding of what they're taking in. It takes something to wake them up. The children of Birmingham were about to wake up the entire nation. On May 2nd, DJ Shelley the Playboy announced, "Kids, there's gonna be a party at the park." It was a signal. Black students of all ages climbed out classroom windows and over fences.
They called it D-Day for the demonstrate today at 12 o'clock noon. I know we were all leaving school.
Some children walked as much as 18 miles to congregate at the 16th Street Baptist Church, site of mass meetings and nonviolent training for the movement. They would face the police they'd been taught to fear. At 1 p.m., James Bevel began sending them out in groups of 50 towards City Hall.
We was the first group out of the church. We got about 4 or 5 blocks and we were stopped by the police. Bull Connor came up and they put those so-and-sos in the car. And when they stopped us, the fear.
Bull Connor and the police were waiting and herded the children into paddy wagons and off to jail. After an hour, they had to commandeer school buses. 973 children were arrested. On their best day, the adult demonstrators had managed 32.
Went to jail 9 days. My experience in jail was horrible.
Cells meant for 50 now held as many as 300 children. Officers beat bodies back from the door with a chain in order to open it far enough to admit more prisoners. While D-Day had yielded many arrests, the events of the day were fairly non-violent. That would not be true of Double D-Day. Once again, students came by the thousands. This time, policemen were waiting with German shepherds and fire hoses. For an hour, students were quietly arrested. But Connor was running out of jail cells. He needed to scare them into stopping. Firemen doubled the water pressure to 100 pounds per square inch. Bull Connor gave the word to let him have it. The water literally blew children off their feet and swept them down the sidewalks. Witnessing this, black millionaire A.G. Gaston interrupted his phone conversation saying, "I can't talk. My people are out there fighting for their lives and my freedom. I have to help them."
Carolyn Mall and 2 other students took shelter against the wall of a nearby building. The water tore her sweater and ripped hair from her scalp. Charles Moore was there to capture the events on film. The water had scattered the students, but as the noise died down, a small group of students still standing could be heard singing, "Freedom." The students regrouped. Police dogs were set on the marchers and even some of the bystanders. Spectators, demonstrators, firemen, and policemen were sent to the hospital. 1,922 children were sent to jail, but the jail was full. They filled the jail yard and were taken to the fairgrounds and locked in the stock pens. Most would stay for 1 to 2 weeks. Wherever they were imprisoned, the songs of the movement rang out and gave them courage.
The effects of the Children's March came quickly, beginning on Miracle Sunday, when parents and children marched together. In spite of Connor's order, the firemen refused to attack. More than 20,000 students had skipped school to go to jail. By May 10th, the businesses of Birmingham had had enough and agreed to desegregate. As children returned to school, however, they were informed that they had been expelled. The school board's decision was appealed all the way to the district court in Atlanta before it was overturned and the students were readmitted.
On May 17th, Life magazine published an 11-page spread of Charles Moore's photos of the Children's March. More than half the country read it. In 186 cities across the country, people marched in support of the youth of Birmingham. In the White House, the photos sickened President Kennedy, who, bolstered by the courage of the children, at last called for change.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cry for equality that I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
On July 23rd, Birmingham repealed its segregation ordinances, and in August, the March on Washington showed the movement was national. That fall, the schools of Birmingham were integrated, but after all these successes, the children would be asked to make one more sacrifice. On the morning of September 15, 1963, just as the Sunday school classes were ending and youth were preparing to usher on this special Youth Sunday, dynamite ripped through the 16th Street Church.
I had planned to go to the bathroom with my friend, and my teacher stopped me and gave me an assignment. I saw Annie to see you in a little while. 15 minutes after I heard the blast, it was a horrible noise. Ground was shaking under us. Something hit me in my head, and I was screaming. And I heard all the kids screaming, and everybody running outside, crying and looking for their loved one.
5 girls in the basement women's restroom were buried under 30-inch thick pieces of the wall. 4 of them died.
My dad saw a gaping hole in the basement where the bricks were blown away. And so when they started digging, and after about 2 or 3 feet, they found the girls' bodies blown together.
The nation was appalled. The need for change was painfully clear. There could be no more Birminghams. The tide of support for civil rights swelled, flowing into Washington and pushing the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation. The next year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 resecured rights that had been part of law but not part of life for a century.
I like to say that my friends, through that bloodshed, that was a down payment of freedom. That was a down payment on history.
The courage and sacrifice of the children finally broke the back of the rule of fear and hatred.
Their innocent hope and bravery revived a dying civil rights movement and changed the future of their world.
They would be afraid no more.